Good morning, all. We are going to, I anticipate we'll have some more folks coming with us, but I want to go ahead and get started. We're very fortunate this morning to have John Witvliet, Senior Scholar and Program Advisor, University Missional Initiatives, and he's going to tell us all of what that means. And his wife is with us, who also is at Belmont. Um, their coming to Belmont is, I think, one of the great coups that the new administration has pulled off. I first met John, although he doesn't remember this, years ago when we were celebrating John Calvin's 400th birthday, and there was a major program at Montreat. And I had the pleasure of hearing him, was so impressed. But even more than that, when I served my church in Illinois, Libertyville, Illinois, many of our music staff would go over to Calvin College for their remarkable program on music and the arts. And that was part of what John had done there. He was long time on faculty at Calvin. His wife was at Hope College, which is in Michigan, a huge thing. You either go it's sort of like either Vanderbilt or University of Tennessee. And here, I mean, it's either one or the other. But both are Dutch Reformed, and both come out of the Christian Reformed tradition. And we are so grateful to have your Reformed presence at Belmont and in this community. So, John, welcome. Thank you so much for coming and being with us this morning.
Thank you, Guy, for that warm welcome. It's wonderful to be here at Westminster Church today. It's wonderful to be in worship this morning. So loved those children leading us along the way. So love the clear way. This is such a wonderful intergenerational community. We had the chance also to visit here this summer and to sing with your congregation, to be present, and open up that printed order of service and see those wonderful teaching notes down the side. Just the thoughtfulness that is about a part of the church here, a great gift. It's been wonderful for Charlotte and me to be in our rookie year at Belmont, a very dynamic place, to have moved from West Michigan to this big, wonderful, dynamic city where there are, 33 things to do on any given night of the week. It's quite remarkable. It's also amazing to have moved to town, to have a top 10 Division I football team just to walk away. And we were present for not one, not two, but 3 victories of Belmont basketball teams just this week. And that's a pretty sweet thing going on right there at the university. So we're grateful to be here. In many ways, the topic that I selected for today seems so fitting for a day in which there are baptisms and in which the children are so active in worship. It's actually to look back to the Reformation period, to a little bit of the Martin Luther, John Calvin story that I think is not as often told. Often when we remember the Reformation, we think about Martin Luther's theses, we think about the breakaway from the Catholic Church and the strong authority held by Rome. Of course, we celebrate the idea that Martin Luther recovered so powerfully from the book of Ephesians and other places about how we are saved by grace. And those are important things to remember. But there are other elements of the Reformation story that I think are beautiful and compelling. And there's just one that I'd like to talk about today. And it's how both Luther and Calvin connected worship and faith formation. It's about how they connected what happened at 8:30 and what will happen at 11 with what is happening right now all over this building. And some of the music that came out of that, some of the other practices that came out of it, and some of the way that that offers us inspiration and encouragement today. So I'd like to begin by telling a little story about how Martin Luther became a composer of church music, and how in 1524, 7 years after he nailed those 95 theses to the door, he actually spent a great deal of time laboring over Psalm 130. One of the great penitential psalms. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. And Luther took this Bible text and translated and reworked it in poetic form so that it could be sung like a hymn. Now, it takes a great deal of artistry to take a Hebrew poem and to turn it into a text that can be sung like a hymn with regular meter, with rhyme, in ways that are both faithful to the text and in ways then that can be accessible. One of Luther's intuitions is that if it could be put in regular poetic form, then it could be sung to a melody that not just the trained schola, not just the trained choir, but ordinary people could more easily sing. And in fact, children could sing. In this very first Lutheran hymnal in 1524, there were 8 songs. Luther wrote 4 of them. And this is by far the most significant of that first hymnal. It's a little hard to make out the notes from that 1524 edition, except that you can perhaps see the most famous interval in all of Luther, early Luther hymnody. If you look at those, the very first note and how it starts out about in the middle and then drops way down and goes back up again. And this was Martin Luther's rendering of "Out of the Depths I Cry to You." In English, it sounds like this. Out of the depths I cry to you. You can feel it, can't you? Dum pum 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 ba dum pum pum. So 1524, Luther sets this psalm in hymn-like form, and then he spends time refining it and polishing it and getting it just right. There's more text than you can read well on the screen, but you get the impression that left-hand side, it starts with the psalm. It's his reworking in that middle column, and then his continued editing in that right-hand column. And I'll give you just a little bit of the second stanza after he got done with his edits. When the second stanza comes out, English translation, as "With you counts nothing but your grace, forgiving all our failing. The best life cannot win the race. Good works are unavailing." He used every opportunity he could to reinforce that message that we are saved by grace alone. A few people have pointed out that he became very insistent about this point, the Lutheran insistence on grace alone. And not a few people have pointed out that Martin Luther, the more he edited these texts, the more he made David, Old Testament figure, sound a lot like Paul, New Testament. He made David sound like Paul with his edits. We could spend a little time thinking about Luther's exegesis, the way he interpreted the text, but the part of the story that I'm interested in telling is actually what happened with this song. What you need to know first is that about at the same time, Luther was putting together a curriculum for the young people in his church. It became Luther's catechism. Luther didn't invent catechisms. The catechism idea went way back to about the 4th century. And actually, in the 100 years that preceded Luther's life, there had been many more recent Catholic then catechisms that were used. And all of those catechisms had the same basic outline. This was the basic curriculum of the Christian faith. What is it that we want to be teaching young children? I mean, even now, right here in this building. So back to the early church, that curriculum became the 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and then whatever they needed to know to participate in baptism or the Lord's Supper. Those became the kind of core elements. And Luther really made the point that this was something that needed to be engaged in home life. And so in Luther's own preface to this catechism in the 1520s, "Therefore it is the duty," for him, every father, "of a family to question and examine children and servants at least once a week and to ascertain what they know of this catechism or are learning, and if they do not know it, to keep them faithfully at it. However, it is not enough for them to comprehend and recite these parts according to the word only, but the young people should also be made to attend the preaching, especially during the time which is devoted to the catechism, that they may hear it explained, may learn to understand what every part contains. This was a program to encourage knowledge and growth in Christian life and faith and engagement in sincere Christian practices over time. And most Protestant traditions developed a practice of catechesis, but here was the Lutheran innovation that interests me. Luther took, "Out of the depths I cry to you," and paired it with 5 other early songs and created a little collection he called catechism songs, Catechismus Lieder. In other words, if we could teach our kids only 6 songs so that they could comprehend the Christian faith, what would those songs be? A 6-song curriculum. And that's an idea, actually, I think is pretty wonderful, pretty profound. It's the music that will be remembered, probably more than the catechism that they recite. And it is a music that has the opportunity not only to teach content up here, but to shape the affections, to shape how it is that we respond to the good news that we are offered in Jesus Christ. Now, we won't go into great detail about each one of these catechism songs, Catechismus Lieder, but I will tell you that these 6 became very famous and very influential in Lutheranism. 200 years later, Johann Sebastian Bach is still writing music on all 6 of these songs, and sometimes a great deal of it. Now, it's important to stress that Luther wanted these songs then not just to be church songs, but to be sung at home. He wrote, "These songs have been composed and sung for your sake so that you can sing them here and at home." But then notice what he railed against out of frustration. "But you sit here engage in these songs sounds like Martin Luther, blocks of wood," he said. "Therefore, I beg you, learn these songs. Sing them with your children at the same time as Paul teaches." That "you sit here like blocks of wood" is not, by the way, what we recommend seminary students say to their congregations. It was very Lutheran, actually. Luther had a way of that high confrontational style. And I include that little quote as a good reminder that, there were real people living there in the 16th century. There was real unevenness. There was an uneven uptake of the Reformation, both in Luther's context, certainly in Calvin's Geneva, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's a little reminder for me and others who make presentations on this part of church history that even when we want to draw from a key lesson or two along the way, that we not idealize it too much and make it seem almost unreal in how we tell the story. So music that was sung in worship, to be then also brought into church school or catechism, to be sung at home, and then picked up at funerals. Already by 1533, there is a set of church order articles that advises when someone dies from the sort of village class, what will happen is that the faithful will summon the schoolmaster so that all the schoolboys will come over and sing during the funeral procession, "Out of the depths I cry to you." In other words, this song became not just a teaching song, not just a penitential song, it became a funeral song. And in 1540s, when Martin Luther died, this song actually was one of the very few sung at his funeral. Kind of a symbol of how significant it had become to the Lutheran community. Perhaps I should add just 1 or 2 more things about these catechism songs. And this is just a little quotation from one of Luther's mentees, a preacher by the name of Matthias, who once preached a sermon on Psalm 130. And in preaching away, made quite a reference to this particular musical setting. So I'll just quote a little bit from the sermon. "Listen in earnest to this instructive psalm, and cry in the name of Jesus Christ to the Heavenly Father, by whose Spirit King David wrote out the psalm for our comfort. And when you do, compare it with your Christian hymn, Aus tiefer Not, in which great men, Luther, has set forth the meaning of the psalm with such a rich spirit and explained it and expounded it so very clearly. So you will discover in truth that the God of all comfort has preserved for you both the Holy Scripture and this comforting psalm, so that you may gain from them patience, comfort, and a blessed hope. I sometimes find that beautiful things in the life of faith are often, they become significant not only when they are of great beauty, strength, and power, but when we hear some testimony about it. When someone comes along and says, "Did you hear the choir this morning? Did you hear that arrangement of the Lord of the Dance that brought us this morning in the 8:30 service right into that moment of death and resurrection in that Alan Pote arrangement?" It's when someone offers a word afterward that sometimes the beauty and power of a given piece of music settles in soul. It's the practice and it's the singing, plus it's the testimony, the explanation, the condemnation that went with this practice. Later, this dimension of Lutheran life actually became celebrated more, I think, more and more. A little bit of a over-the-top quote by 1580 from a key Lutheran writer who, recounting the life of Luther, right? So this is a couple generations after his death, says, "What are we to remember about our dear Martin Luther? What we are to remember is that pious Luther put forth the chief parts of our Christian doctrine into such altogether fine, short, beautiful, and understandable songs that a craftsman in his workshop, a peasant, husbandman, herdsman, shepherd in the field, charcoal burner and woodcutter in the woods, sailors and fishermen in the water, carters, messengers, and other travelers in the road, children and servants at home, or whoever they may be, can easily practice their catechism at any time, and at the same time make confession of their Christian faith, to honor God, teach others, and have a good example, and to comfort and benefit themselves." Now, I remember first time I started reading these quotes thinking, that's a little much. But one of my teachers pointed out something that stuck with me that I think is important about this time period, which was that in most Catholic contexts, people were coached not to have the music sung in liturgy on Sunday echoed in daily life. There was sacred space, there was sacred music that should be sung in that sacred space, but that sacred music sung in that sacred space should actually not be brought into daily life. It would profane the music from that sacred space to bring it into daily life. And one of the innovations then that Luther and Calvin brought to everyday ordinary Christian life is that they argued just the opposite. We want to sing and worship on Sunday in a way that allows us to wake up in the middle of the week whistling one of the songs we picked up. Or maybe more poignantly, when we wake up in the middle of the night, anxious and afraid, that one of those songs can minister to us. And not just to adults, but also to children. And that helps us understand that context a bit. Perhaps the second most significant catechism hymn of the time, and it's the second one I'll mention before making a few remarks about Calvin and Geneva, is the hymn Our Father, Clothed with Majesty, Vater Unser. Martin Luther took each line of the Lord's Prayer, which was such a key part of the catechism, took each phrase of the Lord's Prayer, turned it into a separate verse of poetry so that the meaning of the Lord's Prayer could be sung in an extended hymn. This was not just a catechismus leader catechism hymn to kind of go with part of the catechism. This was actually the catechism itself in the form of a hymn. And this particular song became especially significant in the life of Lutheran congregations and in the lives of a lot of choirs and composers ever since. Perhaps you've heard it before. Our Father, clothed with majesty, provider from eternity, With power beyond all thought and sight, in Christ alone we have the right to know that you, O God, will give what we most need so we can live. To my ears, it sounds a little severe. I mean, C minor. But you put a full, beautiful, big German Baroque organ underneath that sound, it's just absolutely majestic. What's interesting to me is that Luther wrote this poetry near the end of his life after spending a tremendous amount of his writing energy all the way from 1516, before the 95 Theses were nailed to the door, all the way up to 1539 when he wrote this hymn. This is just a list of everything he wrote about the Lord's Prayer. It's a prayer he wanted his people to know, to love, to learn. A lot of these were written, these particular writings, to lay people. And then it's as if he took a lifetime of teaching and super condensed it in the 8 stanzas for this text. Later on, if you were to go to Spotify or YouTube and type Vater unser in the German for this prayer, you could spend from now till next Sunday listening to musical settings of it. And if you just look at that J.S. Bach line in the middle, you'll notice that Bach 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and chorale within the St. John Passion, 8 significant compositions that Bach himself made of Luther's setting of the Lord's Prayer. So that's 200 years later. And it, to me, is a sign that when you link the worship of music with the teaching ministry of the church, and you build in that repetition over time, you create the conditions for a song to become the heart song of a people. And it certainly is the case for that period in Lutheranism. Now, here's a little example from the Reformed tradition. The Reformed, Butzer and then Calvin, also set about the production of catechisms, just like Luther. And one of the features of the catechisms was, of course, the focus on the 10 Commandments. And here's just a little brief note about one of the big differences between Lutherans and the Calvinists when it came to the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments were taught in both Lutheran and Calvinist context as a reminder of human sinfulness. So when we would hear a command, do not murder, or do not bear false witness, that our consciences would be pricked about the ways in which we had not kept or lived up to the commands of God. Commandments would be taught in both Lutheran and Calvinist contexts as something which restrained evil. Those commandments in general created the conditions in which towns and cities could flourish better. But the Calvinists had a third use of the law, it was called, a particular distinctive, in arguing that these commands were not only to convict us of sin, they were also able to guide us as we think about the living of the Christian life. They were a guide for gratitude. There was a positive, forward use of these biblical commands. Historically, one of the bigger differences between Lutheran emphases and Reformed or Calvinist emphases. I love how this is reflected in the catechism music in Geneva. So here's the story. In 1539, John Calvin shows up in Strasbourg. He meets a dude by the name of Martin Butzer. Calvin is in exile from his first little stint in Geneva. Martin Butzer is teaching the 10 Commandments, and Martin Butzer has got the commandments, convict us of sin thing going with particular enthusiasm. Penitential piety to the max. So he actually invited the Christians in Strasbourg to go through every one of the 10 Commandments as part of their penitential prayers. Right? So this morning's prayer of confession was maybe 49, 51 words or so. Imagine it being 350 words. And you would confess as a congregation all 10 commandments. I confess that I've not believed in you, my one God and Father. I confess that I have taken your name in vain. I have confessed that I haven't kept your Sabbath holy. I confess that I've not honored my father and mother. Right? So he's just working through. I realize the text is too small to read, but he's working through every one of the 10 commandments in that penitential mode. This is Martin Bucer, feeling very Lutheran in a way. Yeah. And Calvin shows up there in Strasbourg. And early on, a lot of people don't realize it, Calvin tries to be a liturgical songwriter. He actually writes a few of these metrical psalms and liturgical songs himself. And again, too small to see, but the point can be clear. He writes a musical setting of the 10 Commandments. Let's have a teaching song. And he puts in his first crack at this in 1539 the phrase Kyrie eleison, which always strikes me as very strange for a reformer to echo back that Greek refrain that had been in the Latin liturgy. Kyrie eleison means Lord have mercy. So it's as if Calvin's first musical setting of the 10 Commandments is, you shall have no other gods. We confess that we take other gods. Lord have mercy. We confess that we've taken your name in vain. Lord have mercy. It's shorter than Bucer's long prayer. He got it down to a refrain, but it's still very penitential. 3 years later in Geneva, Calvin takes another crack at it. No Kyrie eleison. He's been writing about this third use of the law, and his musical edits reflect it. And then Calvin does something that's very, very good. He realizes that he has a lot of gifts, but that writing liturgical poetry may not be the best of them. And he goes out and finds the very best poet. It had actually been a poet for the French court by the name of Clement Marot. Marot comes to Geneva, and by the way, this guy's a genius. He ends up writing poetic settings of nearly all 150 psalms, and he's such a genius that when he turns those psalms into meter, the Genevan Psalter features not just 1 meter, not just 2, not just the 6 meters you might learn in an advanced high school poetry class, well, maybe 20 years ago. No, actually, Clement Marot writes French poetry in 110 different meters. Every psalm gets its own meter to set it just right. And then in one of the genius moments for the Reformation, Clement Marot, I sort of picturing him, hearing this teaching on the third use of the law, thinking to himself, I think we need something altogether different than we've ever had before. And what Clement Marot produces is the happiest music that has ever been written to set to the 10 Commandments. We're going to teach our children the 10 Commandments using the music of joy. Hear how the Lord on Sinai's mountain addressed the people of his choice. With them his covenant established. They in the thunder heard his voice. Can you sort of feel it? Yum, pum, 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 pum. Yum, pum, 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 pum. This got, you can, like the tambourine. You want the Queen Elizabeth in England heard about all this Genevan music, and she's the one who reportedly referred to some of this as, quote, the Genevan jigs. The Genevan jigs. The dance-like music that was part of the Genevan Psalter. 100 years later, it turns out, musicians, they like those big pipe organs in Europe, and they made all of the Genevan tunes, it's isorhythmic, meaning all of this rhythmic energy was flattened out, and we sort of lost our capacity to perceive the joy. So anyway, 100 years later, it would have been yum, pum, 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 pum. Doesn't quite. Yum, pum, 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 tum, pum, 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 pum. Much better, I think. what I love here is the sense that they were working at it. Can you feel it? Like, nope, edition 1 didn't quite do it. Second edition didn't quite do it. Third edition, yep. And then we find in a little Genevan village, Charles Perrault. So this is not in big fancy Geneva, but he's out in a village, a couple hours walk from Geneva. And he's describing in his journal what it was like to be a pastor. And he writes, I used to set about designing my Sunday afternoon service, catechism service, by singing through the 10 Commandments with the men and the women or girls, one table of law at the beginning and the other at the end. Having a quote like this is actually pretty important. In other words, this was actually used, and not just in Geneva, but by a small little church out of the way. I also like the next sentence, by the way, except during the extreme cold of winter, when I used to take each of the 2 tables separately. In other words, when it's really cold out, you only want to sing half the hymn in order to wrap things up a little sooner. There's something very humanizing about it. Calvin, it turns out, and I could go on in great detail, but just briefly, also did quite a bit with the Lord's Prayer. Here, Calvin's genius in linking liturgy and faith formation was that in worship on Sunday, if you look at his liturgy, he would get to the prayers of the people and he would extemporaneously pray the Lord's Prayer. And the phrases that he used in extemporaneously articulating the meaning of the Lord's Prayer in this early Genevan liturgy kept getting picked up until they wound up later in a catechism, 1560s, called the Heidelberg Catechism. And the basic lesson here is what people would have heard in worship on Sunday being prayed is what they were being asked to learn in their church school times. There was a connection that was made. And one last very brief example from Geneva that I especially love. Calvin spent a lot of time, as did all the reformers, catechizing about the meaning of the Lord's Supper. And in their mind, they had to re-catechize lay people who in their minds had a superstitious view of what the Mass had meant. Calvin and these reformers spent a lot of time writing about it. One of the most poignant sentences Calvin wrote about the meaning of the Lord's Supper, advice to lay people, is this little quote from the Institutes of Christian Religion. The believer, when he or she sees the sacraments with his or her eyes, does not halt at the physical side of them, but rises up in devout contemplation to those lofty mysteries which lie hidden in the sacraments. There's one tiny little footnote at the end of the Genevan liturgy where Calvin gives the idea that what you could do as the Lord's Supper ends is to sing the song of Simeon. Now let your servant, Lord, according to your word, depart in exultation. Now I in peace may rest, my eyes have seen at last your wonderful salvation. And that little choice of that visual language, I think is a catechetical move. It's helping people understand or have a frame about what the Lord's Supper can be in the Christian life. Catechetical hymns did not stop with the Reformation. So this is a little bonus example. Working on this yesterday, I was like, I have to just tell you one other part of the story. A year and a half ago, Charlotte and I were in Derry, Northern Ireland, walking the walls of Derry. And our tour guide said, and this is where, pointed to the Episcopal manse, this is where a hymn writer by the name of Cecil Francis Alexander once lived. And I thought, Cecil Francis Alexander? I know Cecil Francis Alexander. I know several songs that Cecil Francis Alexander wrote. What I did not know is that the songs that I know and you that she wrote were catechism songs. She published a little collection called Hymns for Little Children. It was one of the greatest selling collections of song in the 19th century. And if you look at the contents page, there's a morning hymn, an evening hymn, a hymn of the Holy Trinity, Holy Baptism, and then you will see the first promise to renounce the devil and his works. Sounds like baptism this morning. In other words, it's all the renunciations of baptism. Then there are hymns about the articles of the Christian faith, the creed. So what kind of creedal songs do you think Cecil Francis Alexander wrote? I believe God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Kids, I want to teach that to you. Let's learn it together. All things bright and beautiful. All Things Bright and Beautiful was written as a catechism song to teach the first article of the creed. I believe in Jesus Christ, conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, once in royal David's city, was written as a catechism song to teach that article of the creed. And then, not quite as well known, but her other famous hymn, There is a Green Hill Far Away Without a City Wall. And that was written as her commentary on Suffering under Pontius Pilate. So again, the point is it's trying to teach the faith through song, but to have songs that would be sung in worship. And I love the way that she lived it in that publication and that became picked up. Is anyone thinking today about the connection of worship and faith formation? And the answer is absolutely yes. So let me tell you about where I've spent a little bit of the last few years. About 3 years ago, Lilly Endowment announced a national initiative called Nurturing Children Through Worship and Prayer. They have awarded 200 church-based organizations throughout the country pretty major grants, like 5-year grants, each over $1 million, to be working at intentional ways of encouraging children's participation in worship, learning the Christian faith in today's context. And as I was getting ready to come this morning, or working on this yesterday, I spent an hour on the phone yesterday with the person who's working on this website that hasn't been released yet, called Imagining Worship with Kids. And as I talked with him yesterday, what struck me is he was thinking very much curricularly. He was thinking, how can we, in a very super condensed way, communicate the most important things of the Christian faith in ways that will link worship and catechesis? And I thought, Ed, I want to give you the Martin Luther Musical Formation Award for the way you're thinking about it. It feels so much like the history that I'm presenting to you. At Indiana Wesleyan University, there is a host organization that's learning from all these 200 organizations. The leader of that, Amanda Drury, is a Princeton Seminary graduate, and she is head of an office there called the Imaginarium. And it's actually quite inspiring to think about all the people nationally that they are connecting with. It's a little like, here, word from the sponsor for me this time, it's a little bit like the office down the street at Belmont, the Creative Arts Collective for Christian Life and Faith, which is one of the joys of my work at Belmont, to connect there. And one of the grants that is being led by Professor Steve Guthrie and Adam Perez right at Belmont is actually a grant on songs for intergenerational use in worship. And in one of the chapel services this past week, we actually heard some of that newly written material. And then my colleagues up at Calvin, at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, have on this particular website, if you were to type in children and faith formation, you probably could find about 100 different resources that are working this territory. So nationally, across a lot of different denominations, it feels to me almost like a recovery of this combination, this fusion, this synergy, and I am just cheering it big time. I think it's wonderful. But now to bring the question right back here to you. What would be the top 5 to 10 songs that you love to sing in worship, that you can sing in Christian education, that you might sing at home too? Now, today you can add them to a personal Spotify list, and also the kind of songs that would be sung at funerals. I actually think it's a good discipline for congregations, but also for families to think, what are our 5 or 10 heart songs? And what songs are we eager to give and hand over to our children? One piece of advice I would have is don't look far before you look near. Why couldn't one of them be right out of your bulletin on a Sunday morning? Cecil Francis Alexander had the Song to the Trinity is right at the top of her list, and we just sang one together. And when we were here this summer, we sang it. So I'm guessing you sing it more often. And it's memorable, it's celebratory. And actually, by having someone come by and say, what a fabulous, energetic way to anchor worship in a Trinitarian every week, every way, even by just having someone say that, maybe next time you sing it, you'll find yourself renewed in your singing of that familiar text that is sung in worship here. I also think one of the best places to look for this kind of music is music that we're going to be singing anyway. And so on my list, I would put Hark the Herald Angels Sing. I think it's the most theologically profound of all the familiar Christmas carols. It's a carol that we want to sing at Christmas. So it's not like the catechetical hymn meister comes in trying to find the most esoteric, hard to sing music that we don't ever want to. No, that's not what we want. We want heart songs that are a joy to sing, that contain a lot of theological protein, and that we actually can't wait to invite our children to sing. I think Hark the Herald, it does it beautifully. And then every family has its own story too. In our family, it is absolutely the hymn, If You But Trust in God to Guide You. It was sung at our wedding, at Charlotte's parents' wedding, at 5 or 6 funerals of great significance. And in our family life, that hymn for us would be in our 5 or 10 list. And those are going to be different songs for every different. And then, of course, in every individual believer's story, there might be an unusual choice. And so I thought I'll briefly share one of mine. This is not going to make it on the top 10 for many, but boy, do I love this one. It's called Christus Paradox. It is just fabulous. You, Lord, are both lamb and shepherd. You are both prince and slave. You are peacemaker and sword bringer of the way you took and gave. You, Jesus, are the everlasting instant. So the one born in a place and time who is everlasting. You whom we both scorn and crave. You who walk each day beside us, sit in power at God's side. You who preach a way that's narrow, have a love that reaches wide. You, the everlasting instant, you who are our pilgrim guide. Worthy is the earthly Jesus, worthy is our cosmic Christ, worthy your defeat and victory, worthy still your peace and strife. You, the everlasting instant, you who are our death and life. So that's definitely high protein. But let's think. The praise God from the blessings flow, hark the herald angels sing. I think Jesus loves we ought to make the list. We sang it this morning. For us, it'd be If You But Trust. I reserve this in the personal privilege slot. What would be your 5? What would be your 10? What are your congregation's 5 or 10? And how would this work out, Guy? Oh, wow. Oh, my song is Love Unknown. Absolutely. Anyone else have a nomination to add to the list? A family song, a particular one you go ahead. How Great Thou Art. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Near My God to Thee. The Belmont Choir just did an amazing arrangement, Near My God to Thee. I'm praying it shows up at Christmas at Belmont, by the way. I'm going to be hoping for it, actually. That's great. Great. My last slide are just 2 resources. The first is a little collection of songs called Sing with the World, that for Charlotte and me was some of our favorite songs to do with our kids. It's an album published by GIA. Alice and Adam is one of the key musicians in the Iona community, and it's songs gathered from around the world. It's just wonderful music. It's for very young children, and the kind of music that would connect so well in the robust, music program here, which I just love. And then second is a book I had a chance to work on with some colleagues at Calvin, which is actually called At Sound School. And it's a little book for young children. Like, it's literally a picture book of paintings based on different verses and concepts from the biblical Psalms. And it kind of works to the same territory. The big idea: connect worship, faith formation, what happens at church, what happens in our daily life, what happens at home, in ways that build us up in the faith. Comments, questions, I'd be happy to answer from any of you. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh, that is such a great question. And the answer is very hard. And that there are exceptionally skilled people who are really good at it. So one of our big projects at Calvin was to publish a book called Santo, 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 Holy, Holy, Holy. It's a collection of 700 songs, 350 from English that were translated into Spanish, 350 that were from Spanish translated into English. And every single one, I guarantee you, I was on the committee that helped work on this. Every single one engendered a debate. Sometimes you would have 2 or 3 translators working on the same text. They would bring out very different approaches, and then we'd have debates. It's kind of like Shark Tank for hymn writers about which one was the better one. Sometimes you would have very accurate translations, but which were like very unsingable. And so there's always that little debate about accuracy versus singability that would kick in. One of the things we discovered, by the way, is that Martin Luther's A Mighty Fortress was translated into Spanish and to English in the 16th century already. And of those 2 languages, which do you think came first? It was actually Spanish that came first in Spain back in the 16th century. And you look at even the Spanish of the German that Luther wrote is just a little different than the English. And it's a big challenge. Speaking of Princeton Seminary, my dear friend Martin Tell is the director of music there, who's working with his musical colleague, and I think it's an Old Testament professor, on a project related to Korean English bilingual singing. And it turns out that is even more difficult than Spanish. But really good people working together, like the team there, can do really well, especially at making it very understandable, very clear, and usable in good ways. It's a great question. Got it. Oh, yeah. So he and I and some others had a chance to work on this little collection called Psalms for All Seasons, and it's multiple musical settings of every psalm, and in very different styles and approaches from different centuries, cultures, and contexts. And so I took it with me this morning because it has Luther's Out of the Depths in Psalm 130 next to 6 or 7 other musical examples from that psalm. Yeah, thanks. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Psalm 103 after the communion. Bless the Lord, O my soul, every time after the Lord's Supper. Yeah. The 10 Commandments were every Sunday And they could move around a little, but most often it would have been, in fact, after the assurance of pardon. So in that, and in the congregation we're most recently affiliated with, Grand Rapids, it was during the Lenten season, the 10 words were read. So not every Sunday, but during Lent, but it was always after the assurance. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. If you can't sing the 10 Commandments, each one to a joyful flute sound, then you're probably not getting it quite right. That's that basic idea. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Thank you so much. It was a joy to be with you here today, and blessings to all you're doing here at Westminster. Good. Good. Thank you so much.
It's such a blessing to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's so
Yeah.
lovely to meet your wife.
Yeah,
This
good.
is great.
Good. Thanks.
I have a little something.
Oh,
for you.
good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.